My future mother-in-law threatened to boycott our wedding over a prenup. I let her boycott herself right out of our lives. I built my company from nothing when I was 23 years old. I started with a small online business selling handmade jewelry and grew it into a brand that now operates in 12 countries. By the time I was 30, I had more money than I ever imagined possible. I bought my parents a house. I paid off my sister's student loans. I invested wisely and watched my wealth multiply. Everything I had came from my own hands and my own ideas and years of sleepless nights building something real. I met my fiancé Graham at a charity event 2 years ago. He worked as a high school teacher and made a modest salary that he loved because he genuinely cared about educating kids. He had no idea who I was when we started talking. He just thought I was a woman in a nice dress who laughed at his terrible jokes. We exchanged numbers and went on a date that weekend. I didn't tell him about my money until our third date because I wanted to make sure he liked me for me. When I finally explained what I did and how successful the company had become, he looked surprised but not interested in the way I'd seen from other men. He didn't ask how much I was worth. He didn't suddenly start suggesting expensive restaurants. He just said that was impressive and asked if I wanted to split the check like we'd been doing. I knew then that Graham was different. We dated for 18 months before he proposed with a ring he saved for over a year to afford. It wasn't expensive by my standards, but it meant everything because he earned every penny himself. I said yes immediately, and we started planning our wedding. That's when I met his mother Opal and everything got complicated. Opal was pleasant enough during our first few meetings. She asked about my work, and I kept things vague because I didn't want to make a big deal about the money. She knew I owned a business, but I don't think she understood the scale until she visited my house for the first time. I live in a gated community in a 5-bedroom home with a pool and a view of the mountains. When Opal walked through the front door, her entire demeanor changed. She started asking very specific questions. She asked how much the house cost. She asked if I owned it outright or had a mortgage. She asked about my investments and my retirement accounts and my future plans for the business. I answered politely but briefly. I didn't like where this was going. After that visit, Opal became intensely interested in the wedding. She offered to help plan everything. She suggested vendors and venues and caterers. Every suggestion happened to be the most expensive option available. She said her son deserved the best, and since I could clearly afford it, why not go all out? I told her Graham and I wanted something simple and meaningful. She said simple was code for cheap and people would talk. When I mentioned the prenup to Graham, he understood completely. He said he'd sign whatever made me comfortable because he wasn't marrying me for money. He said he'd been poor his whole life and planned to keep working regardless of what I had. He said protecting what I built before we met was just common sense. I loved him even more for that response. Opal had a very different reaction. Graham made the mistake of mentioning the prenup during a family dinner. Opal put down her fork and stared at me like I'd insulted her entire bloodline. She asked if I didn't trust her son. I said I trusted him completely, but this was standard practice when one partner had significant assets. She said standard practice was for celebrities and billionaires who thought they were better than everyone else. She asked if I thought I was better than her family. I said this had nothing to do with being better. I said I built my company before I met Graham, and I wanted to protect it the same way I would protect any business asset. The dinner ended badly. Opal didn't speak to me when we left. Graham apologized the whole drive home and promised to talk to her. He said she'd come around once she understood the prenup wasn't about distrust. She didn't come around. She got worse. Opal called me directly the next week and said she would not attend our wedding if we signed a prenup. She said no mother should have to watch her son marry someone who already planned for their divorce. She said Graham deserved someone who would share everything with him unconditionally. I told her the prenup was happening regardless of her feelings. She said then she wouldn't be at the wedding. She hung up before I could respond. Graham was devastated. Opal was demanding I risk everything I'd built to prove my love to a woman who'd known me for less than a year. I decided to call her bluff. I told Graham we should proceed with the wedding exactly as planned. Prenup included. If his mother wanted to boycott, that was her choice. He agreed reluctantly. We sent out invitations. We booked the venue. We arranged catering and flowers and music. We did everything without Opal's input since she'd made it clear she wasn't participating. Opal assumed I would crack under pressure. She told Graham's sister that I would come crawling back once I realized how serious she was. She told relatives she was standing on principle, and I would eventually see reason. She waited for me to call and beg her to come to the wedding. I never called. 2 weeks before the wedding, Opal reached out to Graham asking for an update on the prenup situation. He told her we signed it last month. She exploded. She exploded. My phone started vibrating before we even got home from signing the prenup. 6 voicemails appeared while Graham drove us back to my house. He parked in the driveway and we sat there staring at my phone screen lighting up with notifications. Text messages followed the voicemails. A dozen of them in rapid succession. Graham's face went pale when I opened the first one. The words gold digger jumped out at me in all caps. I scrolled through the rest while Graham sat frozen in the passenger seat. Each message got worse. She called me manipulative and calculating. She said I trapped her son with money and fake love. She demanded I call her immediately to discuss fixing this disaster before it was too late. Graham reached for my phone, but I pulled it back. I needed to hear the voicemails myself. I put the phone on speaker and pressed play on the first one. Opal's voice came through shaky with anger. She said she couldn't believe we went behind her back like sneaky children. She said Graham was making the biggest mistake of his life. The second voicemail was louder. She said I thought I was better than everyone because I had money. The third one called me a user who saw Graham as beneath me. The fourth accused me of planning our divorce before we even got married. The fifth said no real woman would do this to the man she loved. The sixth was just her crying and saying she raised Graham better than this. Graham looked like he might throw up. His hands shook when he finally took my phone and typed out a text to his mother. He showed it to me before sending. It said we weren't changing anything and she needed to decide if she was coming to the wedding or not. He hit send and turned off my phone completely. The next morning, Isabella called Graham while he was making coffee in my kitchen. I heard his phone ring from where I sat at the counter checking work emails. He answered and put it on speaker without thinking. Isabella's voice came through thick with tears. She said Opal had been calling every family member since yesterday. She was telling everyone I forced Graham to sign the prenup by threatening to leave him. She painted me as this rich woman who thought I was too good for their family. She said I was trying to control Graham with my money and make him dependent on me. Isabella kept apologizing between sobs. She said she tried to tell people it wasn't true, but Opal was so convincing. Graham's face went red. He grabbed his phone off the counter and started pacing across my kitchen. He called his aunt first. I could hear him explaining that the prenup was his idea as much as mine. His voice got defensive even though he was telling the truth. He called his uncle next. Same conversation. Same defensive tone. He called 3 cousins after that. Each call sounded more tired than the last. I watched him wear himself down trying to correct his mother's lies. By the time he hung up from the 5th call, he looked exhausted and defeated. His cousin called back an hour later. Then his uncle. Both of them said maybe Graham should reconsider the prenup since it was causing so much family drama. They said weddings were supposed to bring families together, not tear them apart. His cousin said if I really loved Graham, I should trust him enough to share everything. His uncle said the prenup made it look like I was planning for failure instead of believing in the marriage. Neither of them seemed to understand that the prenup protected assets I built before Graham and I even met. Graham defended our decision both times. He explained about my company and the years I spent building it. He said the prenup was just smart business practice, but I could see the weight of family pressure crushing him. He hung up from the 2nd call and sat down on my couch with his head in his hands. His shoulders slumped forward. He stared at the floor without saying anything for 10 minutes. I texted Juliet that afternoon about the family explosion. She showed up at my door 3 hours later with 2 bottles of wine and Thai food from our favorite restaurant. We sat on my back patio while I told her everything. The voicemails, the text messages, the family phone tree of lies, the calls pressuring Graham to reconsider. Juliet listened to all of it and then she laughed. Not a mean laugh, but the kind that cuts through nonsense. She said Opal was playing a classic power move. She was trying to establish dominance before the wedding by testing if she could control major decisions. Juliet took a sip of wine and said Opal saw me as a resource to be accessed rather than a person to respect. That hit me hard because it was exactly right. Opal didn't care about Graham's happiness or our relationship. She cared about what she could get from my money and my success. Juliet said if I gave in now, Opal would never stop pushing boundaries. She would spend our entire marriage trying to manipulate and control us through guilt and family pressure. The wedding planner called the next morning. Her voice sounded stressed when I answered. She said the florist received a call yesterday from someone claiming to be me. The caller requested cancellation of all our flower orders. The florist almost processed it before deciding to double-check with the wedding planner first. I felt my stomach drop. I immediately realized Opal was sabotaging our vendors. I spent the next 2 hours calling everyone. The caterer, the venue coordinator, the photographer, the DJ. I confirmed all our orders were still active. I established password protection for any future changes. Each vendor needed to hear a specific code word from either me or Graham before making any modifications. The caterer said someone had called them too, asking about reducing the guest count. The venue coordinator said they got an inquiry about canceling our date. Graham came home from the school that afternoon and found me still on the phone with vendors. I told him what his mother did. He looked horrified. His face went white and he sat down hard on the nearest chair. But I was just angry. I was angry that Opal was stooping to petty sabotage instead of having an honest conversation about her feelings. Leonardo called Graham 2 days later asking if we could all meet for dinner. He said he wanted to talk through this situation calmly before the wedding. Graham agreed immediately. I could see hope in his eyes that his father might make Opal see reason. I went along with it even though I knew it was pointless. We met at a restaurant downtown on a Thursday evening. Leonardo and Opal were already seated when we arrived. Opal wouldn't look at me. She stared at her menu like it contained the secrets of the universe. Leonardo tried to make small talk about Graham's students and my business. Nobody engaged. The waiter took our orders and disappeared. Leonardo cleared his throat and launched into his mediation attempt. He said both sides had valid concerns. He said maybe we could find a middle ground that made everyone comfortable. He suggested I could put Graham's name on the house as a gesture of good faith, or give him access to one business account to show I trusted him. He talked for an hour about compromise and family unity and starting our marriage on the right foot. I waited until he finished. Then I explained that the prenup protected my company and assets I built over 7 years before meeting Graham. Adding Graham's name to anything would completely defeat that purpose. The prenup wasn't about trust. It was about protecting something I created with my own work before Graham was even part of my life. Leonardo looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat and glanced at Opal. He admitted that Opal felt insulted that I didn't trust Graham. I countered that Graham himself suggested the prenup and signed it willingly. I said Graham understood why it was necessary and supported the decision completely. Graham nodded beside me. Leonardo didn't have an answer for that. The dinner ended with nothing resolved. Our food came and we ate in silence. Opal refused to even look at me as we left. She walked out of the restaurant ahead of everyone else. Leonardo paid the bill and apologized quietly before following his wife. Graham found out from Isabella the next day that Opal was telling extended family not to bring gifts. She said the rich bride didn't need anything. She suggested people skip the wedding entirely since it was going to be awkward and uncomfortable. Isabella heard this from 3 different relatives who called to ask if it was true. Graham called his mother immediately. I was sitting next to him on the couch when he dialed. He didn't put it on speaker, but I could hear Opal's voice through the phone. She was loud and sharp. Graham told her to stop turning family against us. She said if I was going to treat her son like a gold digger, then she would treat me like the snob I was. Graham's voice got louder. He said she was the one making this about money, not us. He said the prenup had nothing to do with his worth as a person. It was just protecting assets that existed before the relationship. Opal said something I couldn't hear clearly. Graham shouted that she was being manipulative and cruel. Then the line went dead. She hung up on him. Graham stared at his phone for a long moment before throwing it across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. 5 days before the wedding, Opal showed up at my house unannounced. I was working in my home office when the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera and saw her standing on my front porch. My stomach twisted, but I opened the door anyway. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. She demanded to speak with me alone. I told her Graham wasn't home. She said good because this conversation was just between us. She stood in my living room and delivered her ultimatum. She would attend the wedding and stop turning family against us if I agreed to void the prenup. She wanted me to sign a new agreement giving Graham 50% ownership of my company immediately. Not after the wedding. Right now. I stared at her for a full 10 seconds. Then I told her that was insane and not happening. She stepped closer to me. Her face was red. She said I would regret choosing money over family. She said I was destroying her son's life and our marriage before it even started. She said I was a selfish woman who only cared about protecting my precious business. Then she turned and walked out. She slammed my front door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall. Graham came home from the school an hour later and found me pacing in the kitchen. I was furious. I told him about his mother's ambush visit and her insane ultimatum. Graham's face crumpled. We sat down at the kitchen table and had the most honest conversation of our relationship. I asked him what marriage meant when his family would always see me as the enemy. I asked if he could actually handle being cut off from his mother. I said I needed to know if he would resent me in 5 years or 10 years for the relationship he lost with his family. Graham broke down crying. He said he loved me and chose me. He said his mother was wrong and cruel and manipulative. He said he didn't want a relationship with someone who treated me this way. But I could see this was destroying him. His hands shook when he reached across the table for mine. Tears ran down his face. He kept saying he was sorry even though none of this was his fault. I hated Opal for putting him through this. I hated that she was willing to destroy her son's happiness to prove some twisted point about control and money. The wedding rehearsal was 3 days later, and I walked into the venue with my stomach in knots. My entire family filled the chairs on my side. My parents sat in the front row. My sister stood near the altar waiting to practice her bridesmaid duties. My best friends from college scattered through the seats laughing and talking. Graham's side looked empty except for 3 people. Isabella sat alone in the second row wearing a nervous expression. Leonardo and Phyllis occupied the front row with a noticeable gap between them like they weren't sure they should sit together. The empty chairs stretched behind them like missing teeth. Graham stood at the altar watching his sparse section, and I saw his shoulders drop. The wedding planner walked us through the ceremony timing and processional order. Isabella practiced walking down the aisle. My sister followed. The planner explained where Graham and I would stand, and how the officiant would guide us through vows. Graham kept glancing at his side of the venue. His jaw was tight. His hands stayed shoved in his pockets. After the rehearsal ended, people mingled near the chairs. My family chatted with the wedding planner about tomorrow's schedule. Graham talked quietly with Leonardo near the back. Phyllis approached me while I was checking flower placement with the florist. She touched my elbow and gestured toward a quiet corner. We walked away from the others and she turned to face me directly. She said she was proud of me for standing my ground. Her voice was low and serious. She said Opal had always been controlling, but this behavior was worse than usual. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing those words from Graham's family. Phyllis wasn't done talking. She pulled me further from the crowd and told me something that made everything click into place. She said Opal tried this same manipulation when Leonardo's brother married someone she didn't approve of years ago. That couple dealt with constant interference and criticism. Opal showed up unannounced at their house. She called them at work. She told other family members lies about the wife. She made every holiday miserable with her comments and demands. The couple eventually moved across the country just to escape her. They only came back for funerals now. Phyllis said Opal respects strength and will keep pushing until someone finally sets a firm boundary that stays firm. She said most people cave because it's easier than dealing with her anger. She said I was doing the right thing even though it felt awful. Her words made me feel less like a monster. I'd been carrying guilt about splitting Graham's family. I'd been wondering if I was being stubborn or cruel. Phyllis validated that this wasn't about me being difficult. This was about Opal testing whether she could control our marriage before it even started. I thanked Phyllis and hugged her. She hugged me back hard and said she'd see me tomorrow. Graham and I drove home in silence. He reached for my hand halfway there and squeezed it. Neither of us knew what to say. The morning of the wedding arrived with my phone ringing at 7. Graham's name lit up the screen. I answered and heard tension in his voice immediately. He said his mother called him. She was at the venue. She wanted to talk to both of us before the ceremony. My stomach dropped. I asked if he was serious. He said yes, and he was already getting dressed. I threw on jeans and a sweater and met him at the venue 30 minutes later. We walked in through the side entrance and found Opal standing near the altar in a navy dress with her hair done. She wore makeup and jewelry. She looked ready for a wedding. Leonardo stood beside her looking uncomfortable in his suit. His hands were clasped in front of him. His eyes darted between Opal and us. Graham asked what was going on. Opal smiled like she was doing us a favor. She said she'd been thinking all night and decided to attend after all. She said she didn't want to miss her son's wedding over a disagreement. Relief started flooding Graham's face until she kept talking. She said she would attend and be civil if I agreed to add one small clause to the prenup. Just one tiny addition. She wanted the prenup to give Graham half of any business growth that occurred during our marriage. She said it was only fair since he'd be supporting me emotionally while I built the company further. She said existing assets could stay mine, but future growth should be shared. Leonardo shifted his weight and stared at the floor. Graham looked at me with panic in his eyes. I felt rage replace the brief hope I'd felt. She was doing this now. 2 hours before our ceremony. She thought she could corner us when we were vulnerable and emotional and force a last-minute change. I looked directly at Opal and kept my voice level. I told her the prenup was signed and filed with our attorneys. This conversation was over. She needed to decide right now if she was staying or leaving. Opal's smile disappeared. She started to speak, but Graham cut her off. He stepped beside me and told his mother he loved her, but he was marrying me with or without her blessing. He said she needed to stop trying to negotiate his marriage like a business deal. His voice shook but stayed firm. He said we were getting married in 2 hours and she could either support that or leave. Opal stared at us. Her face went red. Her mouth opened and closed. Leonardo touched her arm, but she shook him off. She looked at Graham like she was waiting for him to break. He didn't break. He stood next to me with his hand finding mine. Opal turned and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked on the floor. Leonardo hesitated for just a moment before hurrying after her. The door closed behind them. Graham and I stood alone in the empty venue. His hand was shaking in mine. I pulled him into a hug and felt him take a shuddering breath against my shoulder. We held each other for a long minute before the wedding planner came in asking if everything was okay. We separated and Graham wiped his eyes. He said everything was fine. We had a wedding to finish preparing for. The ceremony happened 3 hours later. The venue looked beautiful with white flowers and soft lighting. My side was packed with family and friends. Graham's side had Isabella in a bridesmaid dress standing near the altar, and Phyllis sitting alone in the front row. The empty chairs behind her were obvious. The officiant began, and I walked down the aisle seeing Graham's face. He looked at me like I was the only person in the room. Isabella cried through the entire ceremony. Tears ran down her face during the readings. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue during the vows. Phyllis sat straight in her seat, making sure Graham's section wasn't completely empty. Graham said his vows about choosing to build our own family, and my eyes filled with tears. I knew what those words cost him. I knew he was choosing me over his mother. I said my vows about partnership and trust and building a life together. We exchanged rings. The officiant pronounced us married. Graham kissed me, and I heard cheering from my side and quiet clapping from Isabella and Phyllis. We walked back down the aisle as husband and wife passed the empty chairs that represented his mother's choice. The reception started an hour later at the same venue. We'd moved to a different room with tables and a dance floor. My family filled half the space. Graham's relatives started showing up. His cousin arrived with his wife. His aunt came in with her husband. 2 of his childhood friends walked through the door. None of them had been at the ceremony. They'd skipped the important part but showed up for the party. Graham was gracious. He hugged them and thanked them for coming. I watched him note who was there and who wasn't. I could see him filing away which relatives chose the fun over the commitment. Phyllis gave a toast during dinner. She stood up with her glass and talked about how real family shows up when it matters. She said love means supporting people even when it's complicated. She said Graham and I were starting something beautiful, and she was honored to witness it. People clapped. Some of Graham's relatives looked uncomfortable. Isabella raised her glass high. 3 days after the wedding, I was making coffee in our kitchen when Graham's phone chimed. He picked it up and his expression changed. He showed me the screen. Opal had sent a long email to both of us. The subject line said, "Disappointed." I read it while Graham watched my face. She wrote that she was disappointed we chose to start our marriage by excluding her. She said she hoped we'd reconsider the prenup now that we were legally married. She said it wasn't too late to fix this mistake and welcome her back into our lives properly. Graham took his phone back and typed a response. 1 sentence. He said the prenup was permanent and we weren't discussing it again. He showed me before sending it. I nodded. He hit send. I was proud of him for being direct instead of leaving room for more negotiation. 2 weeks into our marriage, Graham came home from the school and found me working in my office. He stood in the doorway until I looked up. He said he needed to talk. We sat on the couch and he admitted he was grieving. Not the relationship he had with his mother, but the relationship he thought he had. He said he'd believed she loved him unconditionally, but her behavior showed conditions everywhere. He said he was mourning the mother he wanted versus the reality of who she actually was. We talked for over an hour about loving someone while not accepting toxic behavior. We discussed how setting boundaries was different from cutting people off. He decided he would tell Opal they could have a relationship, but only if she stopped trying to control our marriage and financial decisions. He said he'd write her an email laying out clear terms. Leonardo called the next day. Graham put him on speaker. Leonardo apologized for Opal's behavior. He said he'd been making excuses for her controlling tendencies for years. He admitted he should have stood up to her earlier. He said he wanted a relationship with us separate from Opal's drama. He asked if he could take us to dinner to celebrate our marriage properly. Graham agreed. I appreciated that Leonardo was trying, even though I knew going against his wife was hard. We met him for dinner that weekend and he brought gifts. He toasted our marriage. He asked about our honeymoon plans. He acted like a father who wanted to know his son's spouse. My company launched a new product line 6 weeks after the wedding. We'd been developing it for months, and the timing just happened to land during our first weeks of marriage. The line sold out in 3 days. Orders flooded in from retailers. My business partner called saying we needed to increase production immediately. Revenue projections doubled. Graham came home while I was on a call with manufacturers. He waited until I finished and then hugged me. He said he was proud of me. He asked questions about the product and the marketing strategy. He celebrated my success without once acting entitled to it or resentful about the prenup. His genuine pride in my work reminded me exactly why I married him. The prenup sat in our filing cabinet protecting assets that kept growing. Graham taught his students and came home happy. We built our life together without his mother's interference. Opal sent occasional texts testing boundaries. Graham shut them down quickly. We moved forward. 4 months after the wedding, I started planning Thanksgiving at our house. I sent invitations to my parents and sister. I called Isabella and asked if she wanted to come. She said yes immediately. I invited Leonardo and told him Phyllis was welcome too. He thanked me and said they'd both be there. Graham helped me order a turkey from the local butcher, and we bought ingredients for all the side dishes. The week before Thanksgiving, my phone buzzed with a text from Opal asking if she was no longer welcome at family holidays. I showed Graham and he read it twice before responding that she was welcome when she could be respectful. She didn't reply. Thanksgiving morning arrived and I woke up early to start cooking. Graham made coffee and we worked together in the kitchen prepping vegetables and setting the table. My family arrived first with wine and desserts. Isabella showed up next with flowers and hugged us both. Leonardo and Phyllis came last, carrying a homemade pie. We all gathered around the dining room table and I looked at the faces surrounding us. These were the people who showed up. These were the people who supported our marriage without conditions or ultimatums. Graham said a short toast thanking everyone for being there, and I saw his eyes get a little wet. The meal was relaxed and easy without Opal's tension hanging over everything. People laughed and told stories and asked questions about our lives together. Isabella talked about her new job, and Phyllis shared updates about her book club. Leonardo asked Graham about his students and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. After dinner, we sat in the living room and my dad challenged Graham to a card game while everyone else watched. The house felt warm and full in a way that had nothing to do with blood relations and everything to do with chosen family. I cleaned up the kitchen later that night, feeling grateful for the people who stayed and relieved about the person who didn't show up. Isabella pulled me aside 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, while Graham was getting drinks at a family birthday party for one of his cousins. She said Opal had been calling relatives complaining about being excluded from holidays and family events. Several family members apparently told her she brought this on herself by threatening to boycott the wedding and trying to control our marriage. Isabella said her mom was shocked that people weren't taking her side. She said the family dynamics were shifting as people recognized the manipulation tactics now that someone finally stood up to her instead of just giving in to keep the peace. Graham's cousin mentioned to him later that same night that Opal had called her crying about how I turned her son against her. The cousin said she told Opal that Graham made his own choices and maybe she should respect them. Graham seemed lighter after that conversation. He told me on the drive home that he'd spent years thinking he was the only one who saw his mother's behavior clearly. He said it helped knowing other people recognized the patterns too. He said he felt less guilty about the boundaries we set because his family was validating that those boundaries were reasonable. I watched him relax over the following weeks as more relatives reached out to maintain relationships with us, separate from Opal's drama. His aunt invited us to dinner. His cousin asked if we wanted to meet up for drinks. People were choosing to stay connected despite Opal's attempts to turn them against us. 6 months into our marriage, Graham and I sat on our back patio watching the sunset over the mountains. He said he'd been thinking about how much we'd grown stronger by facing the prenup drama together right at the start of our marriage. We established clear boundaries with his mother before we even said our vows. We built our own family traditions during holidays without waiting for permission or approval. We learned we could weather serious conflict as a team and come out closer on the other side. I agreed and added that the prenup that caused so much drama had become completely unimportant to our daily life. We both knew it was never about trust or love. It was about protecting what I built before we met and keeping that separate from our partnership. Graham said he understood that better now than he did when we first signed it. He said watching me handle the business expansion over the past months showed him exactly why the prenup mattered. My success was mine, and his teaching career was his, and our marriage existed separately from those individual achievements. We didn't need to merge everything to prove we loved each other. The legal protection just meant we were smart enough to plan for worst-case situations while hoping for the best. We started planning a belated honeymoon trip the following week. Graham wanted to go somewhere warm with beaches and good food. I suggested a resort in Mexico that Juliet recommended. We booked flights and a hotel room with an ocean view. Graham got excited looking at photos of the property and making lists of activities we could do. We hadn't taken a real vacation since the wedding because of all the family drama and business expansion. This trip felt like finally moving forward without the weight of everything hanging over us. Opal sent a text 2 days before we left asking if we were really going to Mexico without inviting her. Graham responded that it was our honeymoon and we'd already been married 6 months. She didn't reply. On the plane, Graham held my hand during takeoff and said he was genuinely excited about our future together. We'd built exactly the partnership we wanted based on mutual respect and clear communication. We understood that protecting yourself doesn't mean you don't trust your partner. It means you're smart enough to separate love from legal protection. The prenup sat in our filing cabinet protecting my company while we built our life together day by day. Opal sent occasional texts testing boundaries, but Graham shut them down quickly, and we moved on with our lives focused on what we were building instead of what we left behind.